But the real pleasure for me is to have Susanna here with us. Susanna came to work with me as a visiting research fellow in February from Israel. And of course, we all remember what happened in February, or rather in March. So Susanna and I, having met at conferences over the years, and Susanna actually having presented to this research forum in person when she was coming towards the end of her PhD. Actually, all our meetings have been like this online ever since, which is really, really sad. So let me just give you a brief biography of Susanna. She did an undergraduate degree in natural sciences, specializing in psychology at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge. And then she went to the Royal Academy of Music to study advanced performance on the bassoon. And she worked as a freelance self-employed bassoonist in London for a number of years, and then moved to Israel, where she was the principal bassoonist of the Israel Chamber Orchestra for 10 years. Now, somehow during that period, or possibly afterwards, she obtained an MA in music therapy from Bar Ilan University, worked as a music therapist, and started to study for a PhD in music psychology also at Bar Ilan University. The subject of her PhD research was the relationship between music performance anxiety and flow. And I think, although I had heard Susanna present, it wasn't until she came to the ESCOM conference that we hosted at the RNCM in 2015 that I was really blown away by her work. I'm terribly critical of most people's work on music performance anxiety, and Susanna seemed really, really good. So I asked her to come and talk about it at the RNCM, which she did. And I think 2017, does that sound right to you, Susanna? Was it
2018?
2018, okay. So she finished her PhD last, I suppose, August, September, and spent the first 6 months of 2020 working with me at the RNCM, or rather online. And the proposed research project was the experience of aging among self-employed orchestral musicians. However, in the light of the sudden arrival of COVID, the research was revised to an investigation of the impact of COVID-19 on the lives of self-employed orchestral musicians. So Susanna is back in Israel again, living with her husband and her 2 daughters, though I think one of them is abroad. And she's currently, it's very exciting that she got this job. She's currently the research coordinator of an Israel Science Foundation funded research project at Bar Ilan University, investigating the effects of older adult patients' views of aging and departmental ageism on post-hospitalization health. So that is the brief biography of Susanna. But if you have questions about her fascinating career to date and her life, I'm sure she'll be very happy to answer them. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Susanna. I will try and keep an eye on the chat and an eye on potential questions, but at the end we will have time for those. So over to you, Susanna.
Great, fantastic, Jane. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm going to try and share screen. So hopefully we'll launch into the world of PowerPoint. Let's just see if that works. Please do shout out somebody if it doesn't. So you should be able to see that. Yes, fantastic. Okay, that's great. And I'm just going to move it into presenter view so that I can see what I've written. Okay. And okay, and so we're off. So Jane, thank you for the for the introduction. As Jane said, I had been really trying to look for a way to come and work with Jane since we met on an ESCOM conference, and I was so excited when we finally managed to work out the research proposal, and all was fantastic. I arrived at the RNCM at the start of February. 2020, I got ethics approval for the study, looking at the experiences of older musicians. I even managed to do the first 3 interviews with older players, looking at the experiences of aging in orchestras. And on the 15th of March, on the outskirts of London, I did the 3rd interviewer with a player who was just over 70, and on the news, they just started to talk about us needing to, about older players needing to self-isolate. I didn't actually want to flip to that slide quite so quickly. So we returned to Manchester on the 16th of March, and that was the day actually that all of the London theatres closed, and there then followed, if you remember, a terribly scary week where from England we watched all these other countries going into lockdown, and it really looked as if the UK was going to be the control group in a really awful experiment that you just knew that you didn't want to be part of. And on the 23rd of March, Boris Johnson made his "You must all stay at home" speech, which marked the official start of lockdown. And then there was this period of a month. I was up in Manchester with my parents-in-law, who are very elderly and pretty vulnerable. And it was a very bizarre and scary period. And I think that I think like a lot of us, I needed in the next period just to sort of take stock and get used to this new reality. And it got towards the end of April, and I began to think, is there anything that I can salvage from this postdoc? Because it's a terrible shame. What a terrible shame to be in the UK and have Jane around and not to be able to use this. So I started to carry out some interviews on Zoom, which I'll talk a bit more about later, with a hope about, still at this stage, I was still hoping to get some data about the experiences of older musicians. But it soon became very, very clear that it was impossible to talk about anything without first talking about the impact of COVID-19. And as I spoke to more and more players, the older players who I was speaking to asked me whether I was also speaking to younger players, players who were already established in the profession, but who had young families and were probably just getting on the housing ladder, as they imagined that their experiences would be very difficult and, very different, and it would be important to hear from them. So with Jane, we revised and resubmitted forms for the ethical approval, and then expanded this study so that it was an exploration of the impact of COVID-19 on the lives of mid-career and seasoned classical self-employed orchestral musicians. So, and I'm just going to give it's a kind of very gentle trigger warning, especially in view of the postgraduate research seminar, and we talked a bit about discomfort. So I'm just going to say the findings of this study don't make for very happy or comfortable listening. There's a lot of loss, distress, and confusion described in the study. However, it's important to say that during the interviews and the analysis of the findings, I felt that these musicians' love of music, their commitment, awareness, and empathy for others shines out. And I do think that given the appropriate guidance and support, this very resourceful and motivated group of people will be able to navigate their way through this very challenging time. So before we dive in, I just want to say a few words about the UK music industry before the arrival of COVID-19. So the UK music industry was internationally respected, estimated to contribute £5.2 billion a year to the UK economy. There are approximately 200,000 people earning a living in the UK music industry, 14,000 classical orchestral musicians. We know from the literature that it's highly, highly competitive to become an orchestral musician. And we also know that musicians are highly motivated and passionate about their work, and that their sense of identity and sense of self is tightly intertwined with their playing. And there's also literature showing that involuntary career change is perceived as a threat to well-being in this group of people. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the context of UK self-employed orchestral musicians. So, which I imagine being in the UK that everyone knows, but still, when you see the facts, it's still, I think, quite shocking. So unlike in Europe, where the majority of orchestral musicians are salaried, in the UK, 8% of the UK's 14,000 professional orchestral musicians are salaried. So that's the BBC orchestras and the regional orchestras, and that comes to just over 1,000 players. 7% are members of freelance orchestras like the LPO, the LSO, and the Philharmonia. And that leaves the remaining 85%, which is just under 12,000, self-employed musicians who are on short-term contracts as extras and deputy players, or who work on an ad hoc basis. Now, these players, they create successful, busy portfolio careers, which are made up of a rich variety of freelance work, which includes orchestral, West End theatre, chamber music, and commercial and recording sessions, as well as teaching. So, although self-employment has been found to relate to higher job and life satisfaction, there's also evidence that it's accompanied by anxiety about job and financial insecurity. And the current research suggests that COVID-19 is having an impact on mental health and well-being. So if you add to that the insecurity about being a freelance musician with the extra anxiety from COVID-19, and if you add to that there's nobody around to share and shield the burden of career and financial insecurity, this is a population who are deeply passionate and emotionally bound up in their world and been found to find involuntary career transitions traumatic. It might well be that self-employed musicians are very vulnerable at this time. So the aim of this research was to examine how self-employed orchestral musicians at different stages in their careers are experiencing this period. And there were two main research aims. The first, how have established self-employed classical musicians at different stages in their careers been experiencing the unpredicted changes in their situation? And secondly, what are the similarities and differences in the experiences of younger and older orchestral self-employed musicians at this time? So the method, I'll say a little bit about the participants. Participants were 12 mid-career musicians aged 35 to 45 with an average of 40 years of experience. And the seasoned players were aged 35, sorry, that's a mistake. The seasoned were aged 52 to 73 with a mean of 36 years of experience. And there were 10 men, 14 women, 14 string players, 6 woodwind, 4 brass. 12 of the players were living with children and had dependents who were at home. Also 14 had a spouse or a partner, 7 lived on their own, and one lived with a flatmate, 1 with her children, and 1 was separated and temporarily living with parents. The inclusion criteria, and this was very strict so that we could really get the feeling of self-employed, what it means to earn your living from music and music performance and then have that disappear. So you had to be registered as self-employed. You had to earn at least 2/3 of your living from performing before COVID. You had to live within an hour's drive of London. And this was just to narrow down the population. So we didn't have freelance musicians who were based in Manchester, let's say, or in Bristol. And the mid-career musicians were in the 35 to 45 age range, and the seasoned were 50 plus with 25 years of experience. I'll just say the decision was made not to speak to early career musicians, because I wanted people who had already been used to earning their living from music and they weren't trying to build a career. This is all people who already had a successful career. Procedure, we recruited people through posts on Facebook and snowballing, and because it was obviously impossible to meet anybody, all communication was set up through email and WhatsApp. After participants had seen the post, then this was followed up with an email in which I would send them the participant information sheet so that they would know what they were letting themselves in for, that we were going to sit and talk one-to-one about what was going on with them, because this is a time of great distress, and I felt it was very important that people absolutely understood what the nature of the interview was. It wasn't an anonymous tick boxing thing. And indeed, there were some participants who, after they'd seen the participant information sheet, disappeared, and I would send maybe I would send one follow-up phone call, and if they didn't respond, then I let that go, because I understand that not everybody wants to talk about or is able to talk about how they're dealing with this period. So interviews were all carried out on Zoom, which was really quite an exploration and experiment for all of us at the beginning. And the interviews always started with obtaining verbal consent, and then we also did signing electronically of consent forms. Interviews were recorded on Zoom, and they lasted approximately an hour. The shortest one was 45 minutes, and I think the longest one was an hour and 20 minutes. And the video recording was deleted immediately afterwards, and I transferred the audio file to a locked place on my computer, and participants were also asked if they'd be willing to participate in a follow-up study in a year's time. So the form of the interview was a semi-structured interview. There were two main parts of this. The first was an opening, can you give me a short autobiography of your career? It was an orchestral musician. And the second part was, can you say something about the way in which COVID-19 has impacted on your life? There were some players who needed absolutely no prompts. They just spoke for an hour, basically, without very much being added. And then there were others who, in retrospect, when I thought about those interviews, the interviews that had been quite sticky and hard going, I actually realized afterwards were probably because some of the participants I thought actually afterwards were probably quite depressed. And then there were other prompts, and the prompts were really pretty open-ended. Have you had work cancelled? What impact has this had on your finances? How are you managing? Are you practicing? Very, very open questions, which any participant could obviously decide they didn't want to answer anything if they didn't want to at any stage. So the data analysis, we used Braun and Clark's thematic analysis. And so this was I read through all the transcripts through several times, and then they were coded for meaningful phrases, grouped into themes, and then the themes were grouped into overarching themes. And at every stage, then I would meet with Jane, and we, thank you for your time. We spent quite a long time going over transcripts. So thank you for that. So that's the data analysis. The results of the study, so 5 overarching themes and 2 further themes were identified. And I'm going to present the 5 overarching themes and the further themes one by one. So we'll start with loss of career. So this was a very dominant theme, and it comprised 3 main sub-themes: a previously successful career, sudden loss of work, and missing music making and colleagues. So we'll go through the sub-themes. So all participants described having had successful, much-loved careers. So, this supports existing evidence showing that musicians really enjoy their work, have high levels of job satisfaction and good well-being. So here are a couple of quotes. First one, from a seasoned player: I'm very busy, I earn well, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's the diversity, it's the camaraderie, it's the income. And another player said, that ecstasy that you get when you're in there, in the middle, actually in it, you're surrounded by it, doing it, at its best, it's all consuming. The second sub-theme was loss of work. All participants described a sudden loss of work. Life as I knew it completely stopped. Well, basically, my diary's disappeared overnight, all gone. It's like I've died or something. You look at your diary and you think, was it the diary of somebody who just dropped dead? Suddenly, a very, very busy and supposedly successful life has just evaporated. There's nothing there, nothing left. And the loss was experienced as traumatic, using van der Kolk and Fisher's definition of traumatic as meaning overwhelming for one's coping mechanisms, by 6 mid-career and 2 seasoned players. And this is a mid-career player speaking. It suddenly felt just like the rug had pulled out from under my feet, and I felt as if I was grieving my old life. I felt like I was in the middle of a bereavement. It felt like a death because it was so sudden. I felt like I was sort of in free fall. I just didn't quite know what to do with myself. It was just it felt like such an enormous change, literally overnight. So that was one of the mid-career players, and there were noticeably higher levels of distress in the mid-career players when they were reporting their sudden loss of work. So going on to the third sub-theme in this section, which is missing music making and colleagues. So all players described missing the music making and missing colleagues. One said, I'm terribly missing making music with other people, and that sort of inspiration that can happen. That, you know, when a concert goes well, there's just nothing to beat that feeling of people being gathered together in the same place, working for the same thing, and then an audience bringing it all to life, making it all happen. So all these, the last three slides really provide evidence that musicians really, they love their work, they enjoy its social nature, and are deeply invested in it. And I'm just going to read out one slide as well of somebody who talked about, you get the feeling of the whole package, missing colleagues, missing the orchestra, the whole thing. So he said, I miss the music. I miss sitting in a section. I miss driving to work or whatever, turning up, going into the canteen, getting the coffees, getting ready, going in, warming up, looking at the part of it, and just, yeah, the sounds and sights of an orchestra getting ready, people coming in, saying good morning, just the whole thing that surrounds it as well. That's what I love. That's why I do it. And the music itself, the great, wonderful music, being surrounded by that sound, and to play with such a fantastic orchestra like that, it's an honor and a privilege, really. So so you get the picture. They love what they do. The second overarching theme is maintaining identity as a musician, and this was comprised of 4 sub-themes: motivation to practice, challenge to identity, collaborative playing, and teaching. So first of all, motivation to practice. Now, the subject of whether or not players were motivated to practice was present in all of the interviews. 22 players said that they were playing during this period, and there was 1 seasoned player and 1 mid-career player who said that they weren't playing. In terms of their motivations for playing, 5 said it was to reinforce and connect with their identity as a musician. Here's a quote from one player. I'm playing, doing a bit of scales and exercises every day. It's kind of like my religion or my meditation or something. I kind of need to do that every day to remind myself who I am, to ground myself, so that if a day goes by when I feel I haven't accomplished very much, and these days are very strange like that, I can at least go, well, I did my bit of playing. So twice as many seasoned as mid-career players said that they were practicing to improve their skills. One said, I've got into setting myself new challenges, but I'm not doing it in any kind of pressurized way. It's more curious. It's like, what would happen if I tried to do that thing that I thought I could never, ever, ever play? Let's see what's so hard about it. More than twice as many of the seasoned than younger players said that they were playing to maintain their skills for when playing resumed. One player said, basically, I need my technique there, so that if things suddenly do recover, then I'm in a position to carry on working and people won't be turning around and thinking, what the heck's he doing? An equal number of mid-career and seasoned players said they were playing so that they could demonstrate to students. One of them said, it's those higher end students that are making me sure that I don't go, try it like this, and then it comes out as a cacophonous mess, and then they look at me as if to say, well, I think I won't try it like that. So that's what's keeping me practice. Out of those players who talked about struggling to motivate themselves to play and practice, 4 younger musicians expressed a feeling of, what's the point? One of them said, I think more and more because of, I think, the financial things. I've not really felt like practicing very much. And 3 seasoned players who all played non-solo instruments like the double bass and the bassoon, they described the difficulty of motivating themselves to play alone. One of them said, "Our instruments are not meant to be played on their own. We're pack animals, we play as a group." 11 of the 12 mid-career players talked about experiencing a crisis of identity during this period when they were unable to work. One of them said, "You know, I think a lot of musicians, they get their identity from what they do. I confess it was difficult for me going into the lockdown after a while because I had nowhere to escape to, you know. I was just left with my family and I had this young child that needed me a lot, and my sense of pride or purpose that came from playing, doing the sort of things I'd been doing, was gone." And one player described her confusion over her partner's identity as a musician when he started working in the evening, doing food deliveries to make money after his job in a West End show closed. He'd always leave the house at 5:30, drive into London, wearing black clothes, and be back at 11 and do his show. That's been ever since I've known him. And now he's still doing the same, but for a delivery job and leaving a little bit earlier, but he's still wearing black clothes and still coming back at the same time. But for some reason, I'm struggling with it. Everything we've done amounts to nothing right now. Other mid-career participants expressed disappointment in themselves at their lack of motivation to practice during this time. I found it very, very difficult to be motivated to practice. Very difficult, which is hard because I feel sort of a bit disappointed with myself almost, that I haven't been able to. You know, this is the thing I love as well as my job. It's very much part of who I am, playing an instrument professionally, and I haven't done it. You start to think, what is it that I actually do? So these examples all illustrate how a musician's sense of self and identity can be bound up in their work, and also it provides evidence of the difficulty for self-employed musicians of maintaining a sense of identity without some kind of holding environment. By contrast, the seasoned musicians didn't report challenges to their identity as a musician, and they seemed to be robust. One of them said, I'm still a bass player. I haven't got any work, but I'm still a bass player." Older players also seemed able to bring a longer term perspective to this time. And we'll talk a bit more about that later, but just to give you another quote, "It isn't that abnormal for me to have a few bad weeks, you know, when you don't have a lot of work. So I'm sort of used to work dropping away, but then getting incredibly busy. And, you know, it does just go a bit like that." So now let's have a look at collaborative playing. So 15 of the players had been involved in some kind of collaborative playing with others, including participation in online recordings, street concerts, and also playing informally with family members. Interestingly, despite maybe expecting that the younger players would be more comfortable with the technology and more ready to engage in Zoom recordings than the seasoned players, more seasoned players were involved in online recordings than mid-career players. For example, one mid-career player commented on her decision not to participate in a Zoom clip. "You know, people were like, 'Oh, do you fancy recording? You know, we'll meet again.' No, I don't. No, I do not fancy doing that. I suppose it's just been like, I haven't got the time for this. It's just another thing that someone's asking me to do, and I don't want to do it. So I sort of said no." And I'm going to mention this later, but I also think at this point it's worth remembering that during this time of lockdown, and the interviews took place in May and June, there was no school. So that just to keep that in mind, that this is during the homeschooling period as well. So, you know, there wasn't a huge amount of bandwidth possibly for doing collaborative playing. Every musician who did participate in online recordings described them as frustrating and no substitute for playing together. One said, "It wasn't a satisfying way of playing together. It's just, you can tell that there's something not going on, and that's the live interaction that happens between musicians in real time. You just can't replicate that remotely. And another one said, how much easier it would have been if we were all just in the same room performing. We could do it in a handful of minutes, because that's what we do. But it's exhausting and really difficult to do all these videos in your home with a click track and an earpiece in your ear. It's a sad substitute. But despite the frustrations of doing the Zoom clips, the older players did seem to be more positive and tolerant of them. One said, it was nice to see all the familiar faces on the screen when you saw the end results, and to know that there's a kind of solidarity and a feeling like a warmth towards other beings who are all also cooped up at home and who have all lost their careers right now. 4 players had taken part in other real-life collaborations, for example, playing in street concerts for neighbours, such as the NHS. There was one evening when everyone was playing Somewhere Over the Rainbow for the NHS. And the seasoned players who had participated in this enjoyed this. And one of them said, she played with her husband on the doorstep, and she said, the whole street came out, which was just wonderful, and kind of stood around and applauded and wanted it again. And it was very interesting, because I was really buoyed up for that for a while. And I thought, oh my gosh, performance is what I do. And I'm not doing it at the moment. And this was just a tiny flavour of that. And it really meant something. However, in comparison, the 2 mid-career players who'd done street performers found it frustrating and challenging to their identities. One said, it just feels, I feel a bit like the things that we're doing are things that we used to do when we were students, and like straight out of college. Interestingly, 7 participants had taken part in informal family music making, either with children or with their aged parents. And they reported that this had been enjoyable, but very, very far, and a completely different activity from the music making that they were involved in on a professional basis. So teaching. Nearly all of the participants were doing some work as instrumental teachers. The mid-career players were grateful for the teaching, for the income, and for the opportunity to reinforce their identity as musicians, and, as one said, to feel more themselves. So one said, one of the mid-career musicians said, it's good because I'm up, I'm dressed, I'm washed, I look presentable, I do something and that makes me feel like me again. And 2 other mid-career participants said about teaching, I've always felt slightly that maybe people felt that the really good players earned all their money by playing and not by teaching. And as it is, in the current situation, teaching is the only thing that saved us. And that supports some of the evidence that in portfolio career, at a certain stage, teaching is definitely considered as second best to performing. And in fact, one of the mid-career players also referred to her teaching as boring and as a necessary evil. In contrast, many of the seasoned players involved in teaching commented that teaching was an extremely meaningful and important part of their professional lives. One said, my teaching is incredibly important to me. That's becoming a bit more of a focus alongside the playing of the violin and the pedagogic nature of it. It sort of intrigues me more and more. And we'll talk more about the changing status of teaching in the portfolio career later. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Okay, so that was the maintaining identity theme. The 3rd theme was anxiety. This was comprised of 4 themes: anxiety about money, anxiety about future careers, anxiety about the future of the profession, and emotional behavioural signs of distress. So anxiety about money. 22 of the players were anxious about money. The UK government's SICE scheme was introduced at the end of April so that self-employed workers could get the same level of support as employees being paid through the coronavirus job retention scheme. So of the 21 players who had applied for the SICE, 13 had received and 8 were ineligible. So the 8 out of 21 players is 38%, which this is a very small study, but if you look at the MU data, they say 38% of their members were not eligible for the scheme. So we're tying in well with that. Out of those who were ineligible, 5 were ineligible because they had more PAYE earnings. One owed than self-employed earnings. One earned over 50,000, and not as he protested 200,000. He'd earned a teeny tiny bit over 50,000. One had spent a year working abroad and so was ineligible, and another one was a foreign national who had actually applied for universal credit, even though that meant that her residency in the UK after Brexit would be threatened. There is a tendency for musicians to have musician partners, and all of the married musicians in this sample all had musician partners. And in one family, neither partner was receiving any government support, which had placed them in great financial distress. And this player said, our household income is maybe 15% of what it was previously, and you just can't suddenly function on that, you know. I'm trying to operate a combination of future proofing as much as I can, looking at spending what money we've got, selling things on eBay, and you know, all that sort of stuff. We sold our caravan. So although all players expressed concern about their financial situation, the 12 players in the mid-career group were very much more distressed about the financial uncertainty. One said, I'm going to have to try and work out what to do now in order to have a roof over my head and be able to eat. And in contrast, many of the older players acknowledged how fortunate they felt to have financial resilience. And one said, I'm okay, I'm totally afloat, I've saved some money. So again, that's just not true for the youngsters. So we can see that the older players are more financially resilient. And I've just remembered something that I didn't say, which is what the M and the S's are. So the M, in case you didn't know, which you might well not have done, M is for mid-career and S is for seasoned. Apologies for not saying that earlier. And the little, if you see, there's sometimes little black arrows, that's to remind me that there's a quote coming. Okay, so, sorry about that. So the second theme about anxiety was anxiety about the future career. Everyone was anxious about their future careers, and the distress in coping with the uncertainty was more pronounced in the mid-career players. One said, I find it difficult not knowing what I'm going to be doing. I don't have the safety net of a job in any orchestra, so someone in the management can worry about it. Now it's slightly like a black hole of uncertainty, really. No matter how much you'd like to throw at it, there are questions you can't answer. And a lot of these mid-career musicians expressed great confusion about what they should be doing next. One said, I feel I've done this all my life. I don't know what else I can do. I'm feeling really uncertain about everything. I'm nearly 44. I'm not sure I'm up for retraining completely to do something else. I'm not sure I've got that in me right now. I need career advice from somebody, I guess. I really don't want to do anything different, but I think we'll probably have to, and I don't really know what. And that's what's upsetting me. 11 players were actively considering leaving the profession, 7 mid-career players, and one of them said, you know, on a bad day, I'm like literally going on the website, you know, civil service, going, right, I've got a first class degree, I've got really good qualifications, I'm articulate, I'm well organized. I'm 41, I'm not a spring chicken, but nor am I sort of approaching retirement. So do something else. And then I have this kind of miserable evening looking at all these jobs and going, well, I don't know what any of that is, or I don't know whether my skills refer to that. And then go, oh, maybe I'll just go and be a teacher. And then I think, poorly paid, stressful, parents are a nightmare, don't want to do that. If I'd wanted to be a teacher, I'd have done it by now. What about a law conversion? Oh, well, you pay for that. So I have all this kind of erratic thinking over, just do something else, just do something else. You could still enjoy playing as a hobby, do something else. 4 of the seasoned players considered that they may already have retired. That just may be a fact. And in our study, in the mid-career group, 7 out of 12 of the players, that's 54%, were thinking of leaving the profession. And that's similar to the findings of a booking platform called Encore. And the Musicians Union has a figure at the moment that 34% of players are thinking of leaving the profession, which is lower than our study total of 11 out of 24, which is 46% of the musicians in this study. So, anxiety about the future of the music profession. Everyone was worried about this. One participant said, "I know they keep talking about the new normal, but if the new normal means that concert halls and theatres can no longer open and operate, that can't be our new normal." And just over half of the participants described a sense of injustice and unfairness at the treatment of self-employed musicians. One player said, "My brother, you know, we earn the same, similar amounts, and he's being offered money from the orchestra he's employed by, and I'm not. Why the difference?" That really upset me. It's the anger about the unfairness of it, that the self-employed are being treated differently from the employed. They say, now we're helping the self-employed. Now everyone's getting the 80%, but they're so not. People are falling under it, and that discrimination against self-employed is really hurtful when we're all supposed to be in it together. So moving on to the emotional and behavioural signs of distress. 14 players reported feelings of anxiety, hopelessness and depression, and there were more reports of emotional distress and sleep disturbances coming from the younger players. One of the mid-career players said, I feel like, what's the point? On a bad day, what's the point of getting up? There's sort of nothing to do. I feel like I don't really have a purpose. It feels desperate. And just basic looking after yourself, brushing your teeth, you sort of put that off, or have a shower, put that off, or can't quite be bothered to cook, so order some rubbish food to be delivered, and then feel a bit sort of rubbish about yourself. Some days I find it difficult to claw my way out of that. And all 6 of the participants with children described moments of great stress within the family, which supports the growing evidence that COVID-19 has placed a great stress on families. One said, "It's been hard. My mood's not been great. I've found myself getting cross with my family just because I feel sometimes I feel a certain, a sense of resentfulness because I find myself unable to work." And another said, "Because we've had both our boys at home, it's been frustrating beyond belief, really." And also 2 participants in the season group mentioned worry about their parents getting ill, and 2 also mentioned anxiety about getting the virus. Okay, so now on to something a little bit more optimistic after all of that, because it's quite an onslaught of difficult stuff. So coping strategies. And this was the 4th theme, and there were 4 sub-themes: support networks, cognitive strategies, active strategies, and use of social media. So first of all, support networks. 22 of the participants used support networks consisting of friends and family and colleagues. One player said, "I keep going back to that support network of friends who are also musicians, but without them, I think I'd probably be in a very serious mental health place of concern." And another player said, "I went to this musician Zoom meeting and it was just sort of nice. And that made me feel better and feel that we're all in it together. And it's not just me and my partner battling this whole thing, this sense of musical community." And we'll come back to that later. 5 of the participants with young children had said that caring for young children had helped to distract them. And one said, "They still really need me. Having them is such a focus point. You haven't really got that many hours to sit around and panic." And some of the other participants were getting help from the mid-career participants were getting help with childcare from family, which was obviously pretty restricted because that was during the time of lockdown. And 2 of the seasoned musicians had said that their retired parents had offered to give them financial help. Participants made use of a variety of cognitive strategies. 21 used various types of positive and soothing self-talk. One said, "I try and remember I was busy. I was in the right place. I was getting called for work. I've achieved in my career. It's not just going to vanish because everybody's in the same boat. It's not like I've taken a year off and everyone else has continued." And the theme of everybody in it together was mentioned by many other players. Another common cognitive strategy was trying to live in the here and now and actively not let yourself ruminate. There's a lot of underlying anxiety, which I'm managing to push to one side, because right now, here and now, we're okay. We're not going crazy, you know. Right now, if I'm being mindful of living in the moment, we're sort of all right. Some players brought with them a time perspective which helped them to frame the current lack of work as temporary. So we've now moved on to reframing and resilience. One player said, I'll probably look back and think, well, that was 6 months of my career, and that was very odd and a bit shit, but it is only 6 months. And some of the older players compared this period to other difficult periods in their lives, which they'd overcome. Uncertainty is not a problem for me. I've had a very difficult 5 years personally, which had a huge amount of uncertainty in it and difficulty. So lockdown, I know, it's just the same, actually, or maybe even slightly easier. And the well-established players were also able to frame this forced stop in terms of having already had many years of wonderful playing. I don't feel bereft in any way that I'm not doing it now, because maybe, well, I've had so many rich years of doing it. I'm not at the start of my career. I have a lot to show for it. I'm going to push on and not read all of that information now. So the active strategies included physical exercise. One player described how wonderful it was to go for a bike ride, and some of the older players described enjoying their homes and their gardens. One participant reported using an app to help regulate mood and anxiety, and another participant was using prayer. All 14 participants who said they used social media reported having conflicting findings about it. One said, it can just ruin my whole day reading one thing. I've taken it off my phone. However, another one said, I've enjoyed social media during this time. I think it's been a real blessing to have it. There's been some caring people out there and some very useful articles. So that's coping strategies. And now we'll go on to positives and opportunities. So this was the 5th overarching theme. So despite the drastic changes in their working lives and the fact that their futures were surrounded by uncertainty, 14 players reported that positive things had come out of this period. And they were expanding musical skills, developing new skills, health and well-being, and new insights. So the first of these sub-themes was expansion of musical skills. 12 players talked about using this time to improve and develop their playing skills. And it's interesting to note that twice as many seasoned as mid-career players reported that this was a positive of the period. One said, I love that I'm disciplined about practice, and I'm just doing a sort of couple of hours and going and doing practice for practice's sake. And that is a real bonus from COVID. 2 players talked about the time being good for developing online performing opportunities, and these were both mid-career players. One said, live streaming quartets, on Instagram Live, Facebook Live. We've been pretty creative, I think. I mean, it's been fantastic for us. Our profile has been more active in lockdown than it had for a long time previously, just because we were, coming up with initiatives and people were tuning in. The thought at this time last year of doing solo recitals and learning a Bach sonata and that sort of thing and doing it on Instagram, I just wouldn't have done all of that. So it's been positive, definitely. And 4 of the seasoned players had used the time to get websites and marketing off the ground, and that included a website selling instruments, and there was an online forum for helping string players. 3 musicians had developed composing and arranging skills, and 8 talked about developing their community work. And one who works in a conservatoire said, I'm consciously upskilling myself, and at the same time upskilling the professors we have in our department, so that we come out of this with more capacity and more feeling that we've gained things rather than lost things. But if you notice, it's very much that the seasoned players are finding positives within the world of music. They're much more highly represented here than the mid-career players. Other positives. learning a new language and voluntary work. And there were great positives in health and well-being, again, particularly for the older players. And they talked about feeling less stressed and also for having a time for their bodies to recover. One said, an older player, physically, I'm recovering from the sort of aches and pains. So that side of things is definitely better. Yes. So that provides evidence for the threats to well-being, the stresses and the physical dangers of muscular problems that are and can become an inherent part of a long-term playing life. 7 participants measured that there were positive effects on lockdown on family life. A parent of a younger child said, "We've had an amazing opportunity to be together as a family. I've seen milestones. I've been able to see my son literally change on a daily basis because I'm at home all the time." And there were other participants who reported similar things, also indicating, providing support for the research that shows that musicians often have a difficulty in getting a balance right between their work and their family life. In terms of new insights, one player said, "It's been a real sort of period of, just sort of reigniting, certainly, that love of music for music's sake. A bit of a kick up the arse in terms of taking things for granted, for sure." So, onto the virus. Half of the participants thought that they'd had the virus during March or April. None of them had been tested. Several described how they'd been working whilst ill and they'd almost certainly been contagious. One said, "I felt pretty dodgy. I had a temperature, I went to work, and then I lost." Both of us, her and her partner, lost our sense of taste. "I was teaching one-to-one and scraping reeds and giving reeds out to people. Yeah, not thinking about everything. Big, isn't it?" And one of the players described the freelancer's attitude. "I remember sitting around a table a week before the lockdown saying, 'We shouldn't be here. This is ridiculous.' But no one said anything." And I think I'm saying this because I want you to get the freelance, the saying that in any given orchestra, the freelance players will always be more ill than the people who they're depping for. It's because we, as freelancers, you can't really afford to be ill. You go in, and I did feel that compulsion to carry on, even against my better judgment, because it's my income depends on it. Who was I to doubt the government advice? Wow, hadn't really thought about that. But yeah, so this is more evidence that the UK lockdown, the first lockdown, came in too late. Another theme that came shining through, which, well, I found I was very affected and touched by this. The other additional themes was the finding that 23 out of 24 of the players expressed awareness and concern for others, despite this being a time of great anxiety in their own lives. And they were also very concerned for younger players. So the seasoned players were concerned for the mid-career players, and the mid-career players were concerned for the younger ones. One of them said, "I'm extremely anxious for the younger generation, but the young musicians, it's all very well having 25 plus years experience in the profession, but they're at the very beginning of all this. I have a lot of musicians who I've either mentored or I'm in touch with, and it's very worrying for them, and there's nothing very reassuring you can say at the moment." So this empathy and awareness for others may reflect the acute listening and communication skills which are a prerequisite for classical freelance musicians to carry out their everyday work of making music together. So here is a graphic representation of the full model. You can see the centrality of the loss of career and the other main overarching themes and all of the sub-themes. So there's a lot to look at there. So as a summary, all musicians reported the loss of a very much loved, successful career, and they were all anxious about the future. However, we can see it appears that mid-career musicians are more anxious about finance. They're more confused about identity and future careers. They're currently less engaged in music making. They're more distressed, and they're less resilient than older players. All these musicians have had a rough time, but mid-career musicians may well be a population in crisis. Before we have a very brief look at what can be done to possibly help mid-career musicians, I just want to provide a little bit of theoretical support to underpin and support these findings. So first, we're going to look at existing models of a musician's career from a lifespan perspective, and then we'll look at the threat that COVID-19 presents to musicians through Martin Seligman's PERMA model of well-being. So from a lifespan perspective, musicians have been seen to have great longevity. I'm going to go through this very briefly, but there in the lifespan models, there are basically three main stages in an adult musician's career, and we were looking so our group of musicians that we took, the 35 to 45, corresponds with the mid-career musicians, and the late career musicians corresponds to our 55 and over. So the division of this in the early career is generally characterized by the search for employment. Mid-career, and I quote Matuszewski, is the time of greatest performing activity, the widest geographical span of journeys, the highest artistic output. It's a stage of artistic and professional expansion and of the greatest achievements. So this is where our mid-career players were up to, and late career, according to Matuszewski's model, she describes this as a period when there's a greater focus on teaching, passing on skills, and acknowledging one's achievements, and a period of greater social responsibility. And interestingly, this compares and fits in very nicely to Erikson's stages of adult identity development, which I don't have time to, I'm running out of time. So, but it's very interesting that it also corresponds nicely that as you get older, there's a focus on looking at your achievements and wanting to pass on and transfer knowledge to the younger generation. So we can see the mid-career musicians are really, they're in the peak of their achievements, and they've been stopped right into the middle of this in a way that is out of their control. So just looking at threats to well-being from the PERMA model. So this is a model composed of 5 components: positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. I'm just very briefly going to say, so mid-career players, positive emotion, they're really short on positive emotion. They're anxious about financial distress. They're having to deal with great uncertainty, and they've got their kids at home. They're doing homeschooling. The seasoned players, in comparison, are enjoying practicing a bit more. They're still anxious, but they seem to be a little bit more resilient. In terms of their engagement, younger players seem to be less motivated to play and practice and be involved in collaborative playing. Seasoned players are more motivated, so their engagement is higher. But in relationships, lots of players are missing colleagues, but mid-career musicians are also having to deal with family stress with having the kids at home as well. In terms of their meaning, mid-career musicians are suffering from a challenge to their identity, confusion about the meaning of their lives as musicians. And in contrast, seasoned musicians seem a little bit more robust. Their identity is not being challenged. They're getting meaning through playing and teaching and developing other projects. And in terms of achievement, mid-career players have been stopped absolutely in the middle of where they want to be, and seasoned players can look back on already having had meaningful, long, successful careers. So if you take all of this and add this, that musicians are passionate about their performing careers, they're deeply invested, involuntary career transition presents a threat. There's all this evidence that COVID-19 is a threat to well-being, and older people seem to be a little bit more resilient than younger ones. We can see that there's a very good reason why mid-career musicians might be vulnerable and having a rough time. So what can we do? So the UK is going to be emerging very shortly, it looks very positive, from a second lockdown. But although there's talk of vaccines, it's likely that the next 6 months to a year will still be very uncertain, particularly for the self-employed who don't have an employer to look after them. So our findings suggest that many of the participants experience this period as traumatic. And we can look at models of post-traumatic growth to provide some help. So post-traumatic growth is a term used to describe the possibility of transformative positive growth and change as a response to a struggle with great adversity. So what are the steps towards post-traumatic growth? So the first step is emotional regulation, because none of us function very well and are able to think very straight when we're in a state. So the first stage is to bring down levels of emotional distress. And then once an individual is able to function at a lower level of emotional arousal, the second step sense making can take place. Now, this is a meaning making process where people work with attentive companionship, with contentive others, and they can work through what has happened to them. And these attentive others bring patience, empathy, and the capacity to listen well. And this can support and facilitate growth-oriented sense making of a new reality. And these attentive others do not need to be experts. They need to be empathetic, patient, good listeners. And given that the crisis isn't over yet, it might be an idea for musicians' organizations to start training attentive others who can help musicians to acquire these tools for starting on the path to post-traumatic growth. And I also think, given that these musicians are very empathetic, they certainly know the career. So given that the older musicians are empathetic and they know the career, it's possible that seasoned musicians might be able to be trained to be attentive others, to help provide support for the younger players and help them to navigate their way through this period. And you might remember when we talked about coping strategies that one of the mid-career participants emphasized how helpful it had been to be with other musicians and hear and talk to them at this stage. So a few reflections: imperative in the research not to cause greater distress and to look after the interviewees. And I ended with a series of questions to make sure that the participants were not left with all this negative stuff that we'd aired. And I'll talk about that in the questions afterwards, about how we finished the interviews. My researcher bias, well, I had Jane to look through my data to check that it's certainly in the analysis I wasn't too biased. And I think being an insider was probably helpful, certainly in terms of having an idea of where people were up to, understanding the insides of the career. And so there's a question about whether it was researcher bias or insider information. To conclude, the future does look challenging for these mid-career musicians who do seem to be less emotionally resilient and are less financially resilient than the seasoned players. However, it is very, very important that these are previously successful musicians have an amazingly rich and varied skill set, necessarily in order to have achieved an successful career as a self-employed freelance musician. They're highly motivated, dedicated, resourceful, organized, creative, socially skilled, empathetic, and very determined team players. So, with a skill set like that, with the appropriate support and guidance, these players will, I'm sure they'll find their skills very valuable and highly transferable, whatever it is that the future does bring. And that is that. There are a couple of the future publications that Jane and I have got in the pipeline, and references and thank yous to the musicians, absolutely, to the musicians, to Jane and to the RNCM, and also to Help Musicians who have sponsored this work. Thank you very much. Apologies if it was a little long.
I've turned off my mute so you can hear me clapping, I hope. Thank you so very much, Susanna. That's an absolute tour de force, and I don't think it was too long. There was a lot of material in there. I have a question for you while other people are asking questions or thinking of their questions. I've got a list of participants to my right, so you can put your hand up. So far, nobody's got a hand up. You can put a question in the chat, which I have also got open. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask you a starting off question, which is, in a way, it shouldn't, well, no, it is a question I can ask you, which is just a little bit of context. Your previous research was very much quantitative and experiment based. And when we started working on this, you said to me, I haven't really done qualitative research before. And what struck me from reading your interviews was how good they are, how good the interviews were, and how sensitive you were to the musicians that you were talking to. And I wondered if you could say something about how your previous experience helped you to do the interviews. I know I've got Adam and Gavin as first people to ask for questions after you've answered this.
My previous research experience as a quantitative researcher or as a musician?
Well, as a researcher, as a musician, and as a psychologist and therapist.
Well, so I have to say it was a great privilege to be able to have an opportunity to speak to people. And there's something so rich about qualitative data. I mean, you know, all of you who do qualitative research will know this, but this was kind of a surprise to me, quite how you can get a real sense of the experience which you lack in quantitative research. However, when it came to the data analysis, then I found myself very nostalgic for quantitative research, because you just feel flooded in a way that I was not at all used to. And it also, in terms of the qualitative research, in terms of actually doing the interviews, I was thinking about this the other day, and I think that freelance self-employed musicians are extremely good at building up rapport quickly with people that they don't know. I think that that's one of another quality that they have that's also a requirement for the job. And I very much think that helped make the interview go very easily, so that, you know, they were very, very good at building up rapport. Or you know, I was doing my best, but it takes two to tango. And you know, these are a bunch of people who are socially, like, very, very skilled and very nice to be with as well. You know, if you're a freelancer, you have to be nice to be with. And these guys were, you know, despite the distress and the complete chaos surrounding their lives, a lot of them, it was just, there was something, you know, there was something that was very, I mean, I hesitate to say this because the subject matter was so difficult, but, you know, it was very easy to be in their company. So I do think that's a testimony to the sort of people who are engaged as long-term freelancers.
That's fantastic. I was talking to my MMUS students, the ones that I mentor, the other day, and one of them said, I really wanted, you know, the freelance musician course. You know, she said, I had really high hopes of that. But in a way, you've just given a really important message to students who want to become freelancers. And one of them is be nice. Okay, I'm going to go to, I've just picked up a point from Jenny Henley, but I'm going to go Adam Swain first, and then Gavin, and after that, Nelleen and Towie. So Adam Swain first.
Hi, Susanna. Thank you ever so much for your talk, which I found absolutely gripping. And also, I want to say to Jane and Barbara as well, I can't really think of a more important topic for us to talk about right now. So thank you ever so much for putting this on. And it's terrific that it's on YouTube so people can access the research. I just want to ask a question about other ways in which you're disseminating the findings, actually, because of course they're absolutely no surprise to us. We're working, this is a building full of freelancers. We know that they're nice people and that they're easy company. We work with them every day, and we can see with our own eyes and ears and on our social media feeds that that people are experiencing a lot of distress. So I want to ask how this information is going to get out there, because everyone needs to know about it, and also how you avoid in that respect the sort of this is very difficult, because I absolutely love the research you're doing, so I don't want to seem that I don't, but of course you've got some great research out of this, so in many ways you're benefiting from the disaster that's happening to everyone else, and of course it's absolutely ethically sound, and you've conducted it in completely the right way. But how can we feed back to those musicians that are suffering such distress in real, perhaps economic and social terms, benefits from this research that clearly you're gaining yourself as well?
So to respond, the research is being sponsored by Help Musicians UK. I don't think, I can't see that Kezia is here, but so from there, so the research, so they've seen some of this already. So the idea is it goes straight back to Help Musicians, and then, you know, the hope is that some of those recommendations about you know, getting sense making processes and some help for people, and like getting some online workshops and in place. The hope is that there will be some very genuine and real practical help that comes out of it. So the dissemination of findings also, that sort of gets it in terms of getting it out into the public. It's a little bit restricted because we're trying to get some papers out of it, and then there's this business about how, when can you release what to whom. So I'm sort of leaving that more in Jane's hands about what's allowed to go to whom when. Can I answer your second point before Jane comes in? In terms of my personal gain, it's sort of quite difficult for me to know what that is, really, because I'm in Israel and I'm not really at the moment, I've not managed to find work doing stuff about musicians and COVID or anything. So my personal gain, I mean, there'll be a couple of articles out of it, but as far as I'm concerned, that's really incidental. My commitment is, as somebody who was a musician, and that it's so very, very, very close. If you have all sorts of crossroads in your life and you make certain decisions, and I could so easily be one of those musicians, and so I'm really quite committed to the research being helpful. And does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. Yeah, I hope it gets that as far as possible.
I just wanted to say that the journals to which we've submitted, one of them is an open access journal that normally charges thousands of pounds for the privilege of publishing in it, but they are waiving the fees providing the manuscript is submitted by the 31st of December. So it will be. The other article will be published in the Journal of Music, Health and Wellbeing. It's a relatively new journal, and it is publishing exclusively on COVID-19 related research. Again, that's free to publish in, and that will have wide dissemination. But the most important thing is actually the report to Help Musicians UK. And their dissemination. I want to move on to Gavin. He's next on the list.
Thank you, Jane. Hello, Susanna. Thank you for this fascinating talk. And I'm speaking as a member of the RNCM, a fellow in creative practice. And as such, I co-run the artist development program at the RNCM, where we're working with pre-career students about how they can build their career. And it's something that we've been covering quite a lot, as you might expect this term, about how to build a sense of value in what we're doing and a sense of community in order that we can have a stronger voice in representing ourselves as freelance musicians. And I was just wondering, with the people you were interviewing, whether they mentioned anything about that wider community, whether they had been able to access information and help from, for example, the Musicians Union or the ISM, or whether some of the organizations who they might regularly have worked for had actually taken any role in supporting them while they were going through this period.
So I think there was one who really emphasized how important it had been to her to go to these online meetings, and there had been some that were offered by a variety of different organizations, the ISM and the MU and Help Musicians UK. And certainly she had been going to those online meetings and had found them very helpful. And a number of the musicians had also been in touch with the MU and Help Musicians more about trying to get extra funding and get some of their grants. But this was in May and June, but none of the others talked, only one really talked about regularly making use of resources offered by the organizations. No, and it's probably an underused resource, because from there, I've looked online, there is really a lot going on, and there's some very good, useful, helpful workshops going on. So I think it's an underused resource, but I also think at the point at which I spoke to a lot of the musicians, some of them, particularly the younger ones, were really quite flooded and were finding it quite difficult just to manage with their day-to-day life. But if they'd had regular emails saying, come to this session, and I imagine that might well have helped. There might have been take up for that.
Thank you.
Can we go to Nellie next, please?
Okay, thanks, Jane. Susanna, thank you for the detailed presentation. I enjoyed it very much. One thing I want to mention was something that resonated with my research was that how passionate musicians are about their work. So my question is, this is something I've been curious about in the past few weeks. Did you find anything in the conversations that showed that musicians are appreciating what they had more now since it was taken away, like due to the lockdown and they had to stop work? Did you feel a sense of appreciation of the work they do and all that because it was taken away? Do you know what I mean?
Yes. So thank you for that point. So what I'd say is that appreciation that I had, I think it was very much more pronounced with the seasoned players, with the older group. I think with the younger players, one of the ones who was appreciating what he'd had, he was actually still doing stuff. He was doing stuff online, but I think more of the mid-career players were confused, and they were confused. What am I going to do now? And weren't able to stop and think that was great. It was more, for them, it wasn't a case of what I have. It was a case of, what's missing, what I don't have. Whereas with the older players, there was great appreciation of being involved in this amazing profession, having had this amazing life for the last 25 years. But in the younger ones, there was the lack was very, very much more present.
Okay, thank you.
After Nellie, we go to Towie, and after Towie, we go to Jenny Henley.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Susanna. I think Adam used the word gripping, and yeah, I was following through on all the quotes and just drinking in. It felt a bit like sort of taking a deep breath in some way, like just finally getting some sort of a handle on the broad picture about how this is affecting everyone. I hope this isn't too much of a general question, but I was going to ask, do you think that from what you've studied here and through the experience of the crisis in general, that it's exposed actually how fragile the careers of many musicians were even in normal times prior to this?
So from people working on the inside, if you know what that career is, you know how very fragile it is. So is the question, do you think it's exposed to the outside world, how that fragile it is, or to the players themselves?
Yeah, I guess more broadly, I suppose, to everyone. But I mean, personally, I know a lot of freelance musicians, but I don't feel like I have a good handle on how secure they are. So, I mean, to me, this was a bit of a revelation. I was wondering if...
So I think there's a great deal of anxiety amongst freelancers. Normally, I think they're very aware of how fragile it is. And in fact, one of the quotes that I didn't read out because we were getting short of time was how at the end, in terms of positives, in terms of health and well-being positives, some say, and this is really established and successful players, how marvelous it is not to worry that the phone isn't ringing, because there's no possibility of the phone ringing. And that is just the most incredible relief, because it's not because you've messed something up or because you're not getting the work, it's because there's no work. So I think that the freelancers themselves are all too aware of how fragile it is and how easily you can be rubbed from a list and how little security you have. So I think the musicians themselves are really aware. I mean, I think it's one of those things, it's sort of like, it's kind of the elephant in the room, really. So of being a freelancer, when you're freelancing, one of those questions that people do or don't ask is, and it varies at different stages of your career, is, are you busy? And that's one of those questions. And now it's kind of gone out the window because nobody's busy. So yes, I think that inside the career, I think there's huge awareness of quite how fragile it is. And outside, I don't think there's probably any awareness at all that, that the vast majority of players here are self-employed. I think there's very, very little awareness. So yeah, there's room for people to find out about that for sure.
Jenny Henley made a point in the discussion on the chat about researcher bias. And Susanna, you'll remember you put researcher bias on the slide, and I said, could you at least put it in inverted commas, because in qualitative research it isn't, there really isn't researcher bias. And Jenny, I just wondered whether you would like to say a little bit about that. We've got a lot of PhD students who've heard me go on about this, but it would be lovely for them to hear you.
Hello, yes, sorry, I'm just getting my methodological geek on here. But yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting the way that you thought about that, and it's very connected with the question from Adam as well about how you're sort of, leaving the research field, if you like. And I put a paper in the chat which I've always found really helpful, which is very interesting because it talks about the boundaries and having to map the boundaries of insider research. And of course, qualitative research, the whole point of it is that you know the field and you understand the field, and that's to be celebrated. But it's all about positionality, isn't it? And being very reflexive as opposed to reflective. So the reflexivity of you as a researcher, so understanding the different positions that you hold and then how you use those positions in your research. So for example, Susanna, you hold the position of musician and researcher and all the different hats that you have on, and then you kind of like create a matrix of those positions in order to draw out your understanding of whatever it is that you're looking at. But there's something really interesting about how you leave the field, and that's really crucial in qualitative research because of course you're part of it. And there's, I mean, I've worked in secure environments and prisons, and that's a very interesting kind of issue, how you leave the research field and you're leaving people within the field, etc. But I just thought that, for me, from a methodological perspective, I think that was really, really interesting to draw that out. And it is linked to these wider questions that of in educational ethics, it's always about what you're leaving people with and how you're benefiting from, their contribution to the research and stuff. So I just thought that was really interesting.
Thank you very much indeed for that contribution, Jenny. That's really helpful. We've got a question from Jack, and after Jack, Annika.
Jane, actually, I just wondered whether I could just respond very slightly to that with Jenny, and also to Adam's question before, because one of the things that I didn't actually have a time to say, I mean, it's a different sort of, it's a very concrete finishing off of the interview, but I didn't have a chance to say about how we did finish the interviews, because and I think it's important just to sort of set the scene about how we did finish the interview, so how the interviewees felt at the end, because I was very, very conscious that it would be terrible to get people to talk about what they're going through for an hour and then leave them with this turmoil, with all of this stuff aired and just hanging in the air. So just to sort of add this to sort of, so you can get the feeling of how the actual interviews ended. So there were two questions at the end of the interview which were designed to sort of help people move out of possibly a very emotional state into a more empowered state, and which I haven't reported on. And the first one of these was, is there anything that music colleges can learn from this period? Which I also thought, I put that in because I thought that might be interesting for the college, and I also thought it gives people a chance to remove themselves from being in this place and then to use their expertise. What have you got to say about this that we could learn from that? And the other thing at the end was to help try and frame this period as temporary. And as part of the whole positive psychology movement that people know, they have a sense of what they need. The final question before, is there anything else you want to ask? The final question was, if you can imagine yourself 10 years down the line, what do you think your 10 years older self would have to say to you, which would help you to get through this period? So that it was very much framed that people weren't left, you know, having aired all this difficult stuff. And then I just said, oh, well, thank you, that's great, bye. So just to add that, to give a sense of what the interview finished like.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Susanna. It's Jack's turn to ask a question.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks, Susanna, for a fascinating presentation. And actually, your comment just there touched on something I was just about to ask, because I come with the situation from a slightly odd perspective in that I've had higher education training and significant freelance experience in both the UK and abroad. And so I can kind of see the situation from an outsider's perspective in a certain way, but also not. And so I'm wondering if because your question, you said you asked them if they had anything they thought that music colleges could learn from this. If any of the participants expressed, I mean, I'm sure they expressed many different frustrations during the interview with the system and with the inherent precariousness of the freelance world, but also if they had anything to say regarding along the lines of, I wish that I was taught this, or I wish that I was prepared in this way, or I wish that I knew that. If there was anything that they thought they could have, that they tools that they wish they had that would have made them better overcome this.
So that, it was really interesting what they said in response to the question of what could music colleges offer. So I think there's a lot of the older players said things that actually music colleges are now offering more, which is to broaden and diversity, absolutely not to put all your eggs in one basket. And this was the, you know, sort of the overwhelming message that came out from this. Encourage people to diversify. Don't be snobby about expecting to have just a performing career. Things that I think that music colleges really have got a lot better at in the last few years. But the main thing was diversify, be encouraged to diversify. Don't expect things to turn out the way that you think they're going to, and be prepared to be flexible and resourceful. That was basically the main thing that came out.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to say that I did my undergraduate studies at the RNCM a decade ago, and I am very impressed in the way that has developed since I left, and also compared with my master's studies that I did in Germany, where such professional development skills are not taught at all, essentially. So it's those things are certainly being addressed.
And just to take that up, Gavin, I haven't lost touch with the fact that we have Annika and Michelle who have questions as well. But if I can just take up, Gavin, would you like to ask your question?
Oh yes, thanks, Jane. Is this the one about any political?
Yes.
Yeah. So Susanna, I was just thinking to myself about whether there was any sort of political comment during the conversations you were having with the interviewees. The presentation seems to be pretty apolitical. It talks about COVID-19 as a sort of an abstract, as it were, rather than the policies which are in response to COVID-19. So I was just wondering if anything came up about that, whether interviewees were broadly in support of government policy or perhaps were challenging them.
Oh, thank you for that comment. Well, that's fantastic, because I've been incredibly diplomatic then, if there's nothing political that's come through at all.
I think you mentioned government once, from what I was hearing.
Okay, yes. Yeah, no, it was savagely against. It was overwhelmingly against. One person was, I mean, it wasn't as much of a theme, but whenever anything about the government was mentioned, it was in connection with a lack of support and a lack of understanding. And how can it be that people are allowed to go and queue into a Nike shop and go on the tube and where they might be all together, whereas in a concert hall people will be much more disciplined. Most of the participants were very negative about the government handling of it. Yeah, I'm sorry if that didn't come out. I think, well, actually, no, I'm probably glad. I was trying to be diplomatic.
So I'm actually just going to pick, Barbara, you pointed out, you said you supported the view that it's important the research is made public so that the impact is better on freelance musicians and their circumstances is better and more widely understood. And just really to say, you said, could this inform policy in any way? This is what Help Musicians will be doing. And I explained, Adam asked about, he said, can't you get this to the press? And the answer is yes, but not until the first paper has been peer reviewed and accepted. I mean, I think people, since the beginning of the pandemic, people have begun to get a little bit better about understanding the difference between non-peer reviewed and peer reviewed articles. But, as a researcher, I would say until it's been peer reviewed and, two peers have agreed that it can be published, that's the point when we make it public, because otherwise we'll be criticized. Adam.
Yeah, I just to come in, I do understand that, Jane. That is really, really very important. But I'm thinking the other side of the peer review process, because the last thing we want to do is hide behind books when this is so important.
Yeah. It's just, I worry about it's so easy to pick holes in it until it's published. Barbara.
It's just that there seems to be almost a dismissal from certain quarters about what's happening to musicians. And we found this. I found it with, I don't think Nick is with us at the moment, is he? As he was at the beginning, Nick Rayland. But that whole application where the comment from the reviewer was, well, if it were about sport, we'd fund it, but it's not important enough. And I've come across this in other contexts where if something, you're looking at reviewers, if it's just about music, well, then somehow it's not as significant or as important. But I think, I love the way you reflected as a real compassion for the people you were talking about. You did that in a quite a moving way, and I think it tells a really interesting story. It's just, I think our area is seen as somehow a little, it's a shame the theatres and the concert halls are closed, but actually it's not the essential, not the important thing. But I think you bring to life something that is much more, gives a much better insight into the lives of these people who are seriously affected. So,
but we're hearing this the whole time, and pretty much every time Mr. Johnson is asked about support for the hundreds of thousands of people who have fallen through the net, he just deflects it. He just doesn't want to know about self-employed musicians, the musicians who pay themselves through dividends, the musicians who are not quite earning 50,000 a year, or only just over 50,000 a year. I mean, it's horrifying, and totally. Gavin, we agree completely. It is important to take the message to the policymakers. And yes, there are similar studies for other performing arts. I know people are doing this in dance, for example, and in theatre. I'm aware of time because I'm hoping everybody isn't just, hoping people will stay on a little while. But Annika has been waiting really patiently, and so has Michelle, and they're really our last. So Annika, your question, please.
Oh, yeah, it's already been answered by now. My question just also had to do with news outlets. Basically, it was just one little suggestion, which is the conversation, of course, which sits somewhere between this. I mean, on its homepage, it says academic rigor, journalistic flair. That was pretty much the only comment I wanted to make. And it also, I just called it up because I wanted to see what's there. It has a big COVID-19 tab now where all the kind of current research goes, and right next to it is arts and culture. So maybe publishing there might also be interesting. They're often very, very, very crunchy and very good, these articles. But obviously best whether it's better to wait for peer review, etc. It also
I would just say, please let us finish the Frontiers paper by the 31st of December. Otherwise, we've got to find £2,000. Once we've done that, then we've got all the themes and the data together. And that's the point when we start putting together articles for the equivalent of professional journals. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of doing PhD supervisor hat here and say, get the papers out, then get it to the, and it is, we're talking about, we're talking, it'll be there in 28 days. We're talking 4 weeks time, it'll be out there. Right, Michelle, thank you, Annika. Michelle.
It's fascinating. It's great discussion. I've enjoyed all the discussion and chat, and thank you, Susanna. It's great work, and it was such a shame that we'd only just started to benefit from you being with us when everything came crashing down around our ears. It was just a quick one. I was just thinking, I mean, it's just fascinating, isn't it? And I just wondered if you had any plans for a quantitative study, because to me it seems that this is, an ideal pairing might be to take what you found out, those rich things that you've got from your qualitative research, and next to ask the question, how widespread is this, and to do something quantitative that could get the impression of just how many musicians around the world are affected in these different ways.
That's interesting. I'd love to do that, because I'm probably still more comfortable in quantitative than qualitative research. That's an interesting thought. Thank you. Yes.
We'll think about it, and we will talk about it. Here we go. So Jack says, Jack, do you want to say what you've just written?
Okay, I just wrote it instead, but I just wanted to point out that the political situation may well be the case in the UK. I'm not trying to defend it at all, but it's not different any other places where they also have comparatively much greater public support for the arts, generally speaking.
It's so sad. I don't know whether to say, it's kind of like two wrongs don't make a right.
Sure.
It's terrible for everybody. There are, and it's wonderful when we do see friends who are giving concerts, when things have lifted. And it's, yes, well, Barbara is saying there have been more performances in France and Germany, and I think there will be more made available online. I mean, let's just look at one tiny little chink of light. I mean, to receive the program for the Cunning Little Vixen today was lovely. And to know that, all right, the performances aren't going to be, it's not going to be like it usually is at Christmas when we come to see the opera. But
just to respond, sorry to interrupt, but just to respond to Barbara's point, there were indeed many performances in the summer in France and Germany. I was simply commenting on the situation right now, which is that in France and Germany, all shops are open and sporting institutions are limited open, but all cultural institutions are shut.
Susanna, is there anything that you would like to say really to close before I do final thank yous?
Well, not really, only just again to stress that, the skill set of self-employed orchestral musicians is extraordinary. I mean, it's so varied and diverse, and to be successful, you really do need to have, you need to really be very good at all these different things, and you also have to be very, very determined. So, so I imagine that these players will be okay, maybe not as musicians, which is not very, that's not very consoling. So for me at least, that's what I leave this little bit of research with. I mean, we're hoping to do, Jane and I, we've talked about doing a follow-up in a year's time to see where everyone's up to. So I'm hoping that we can do that, because it'll be very interesting to see, because these are, they're an amazing bunch of people. They really are. So so I'm curious to see that, how they manage to navigate their way through this.
Well, I'm going to end by thanking you on everybody's behalf, Susanna. It's just been so lovely to have you with us. I'm so sorry that it wasn't in person. I've actually had the pleasure of having Susanna in some other meetings over this period, so she's become part of another community that I'm part of. But it's been lovely to be able to do this research, and there's a little bit of me that thinks, actually, when you say you think that these musicians are going to be all right. Part of what is going to make them all right, part of what is going to have helped them, is the opportunity to talk to you and to be able to articulate the way that they came through the first 2 or 3 months of lockdown. And it will be really interesting to follow them up. But thank you everybody for your contributions. As Michelle says, it was a really, really interesting discussion, as it always is. It is 2 minutes to 6. We very often, I don't know, Susanna, it's later with you. Do you have to rush off and make supper for your family?
No,
Oh,
no,
hooray. And we can't really have we can have a virtual bar if we all bring our own drinks or cups of coffee. I'm going to go away just for 3 minutes to fill my teacup. And then I'll come back. And if anybody else would like to stay with us, please do. I don't know if there's anybody here who
Jane,
can
would you,
YouTube. Yes.
Jane, would you like to just, I've made you the host, would you like to stop the YouTube stream?
I've done it. Thank you. Thank you everybody on YouTube. Sorry you're not